It's very good to see people here in Sydney supporting the work of Wikileaks and defending someone who should not be in the situation he's in. This is an historic press freedom case. This is how I became more involved and started to host the vigils. Unfortunately, most members of the media, when they once profited from WikiLeaks' work, have turned against WikiLeaks and Assange in particular, and they've made it personal as well. They smeared him, which is what people in power do, and they are being challenged and they don't really have a response. They make it personal and attack, and he has been very much the brunt of those attacks. It's quite a shame to see that happening. They call themselves journalists, but they're failing, and that's the reason why we need whistleblowers and WikiLeaks. The title of this event is Whistleblowers, WikiLeaks, and the Future of Democracy. When I thought about that, I could only think about the past of democracy. I mean, how much we've had and how little seems to be remaining. And I don't exaggerate. We take for granted in the Western countries, and even though you aren't in the West here in Australia, you're lumped in pretty much with the West, Western culture. We take for granted that we have a democracy simply because our leaders tell us we do, and we remember when we had more rights, we have elections. And that's supposed to be it. And we've got a free market economy, and they conflate democracy with free markets, and they're really nothing to do with one another. And if you don't believe that, just look at Pinochet's Chile, which was the test case for the neoliberal project of the Chicago School. And that was without any question, military dictatorship, but they had the most freest markets to that time. And it's now spread all over the world, and that's what we're facing. That has led to incredible amounts of inequality on levels maybe the West hasn't seen since the Gilded Age in the US, the 1920s. And this is a really, really huge problem that the middle class seems to be evaporating before our eyes, and the money is transferred to the 1% through a variety of means, including privatization, deregulation, the use of international financial institutions to cut back on social spending. So if we think that we still have a democracy or our democracies are not under threat, that is one sign that it is under threat, maybe even on life support, the existence of this incredible economic inequality. But even worse maybe is what we've learned, and what shocked many people, even in the mainstream, and they published the stories, but it seemed to have gone away. And it's just part of the fabric of our societies and culture. We seem to accept, I'm not talking about the people in this room, I'm talking about the vast majority of peoples in our countries, and particularly in the corporate media, and I'm talking about surveillance, warrantless mass surveillance of our citizens. And of course, this was revealed in a shocking way, confirming what many suspected by, of course, Edward Snowden and others before him as well. But Snowden really had the motherlode of the information that let us know what exactly our electronic and other intelligence agencies were doing to keep monitoring, not necessarily in live way, but they record everything that's going on, including this event. I mean, anything that's on the web is being stored, and if they need to look up somebody's name, it'll be archived there. So this is beyond chilling and beyond a confirmation of 1984, whose book sales, by the way, spiked when the Snowden story came out. Everyone rushed to the bookstore, the library, to read Orwell again. And what they read there was a confirmation that this dystopia that he had predicted was pretty much happening. And as I say, this we accept it now. The mainstream accepts this, even if they were shocked at first and reported on that. There's also the existence of war, a permanent war. This was also part of Orwell, if you recall, in the book. There was always in the background some report going on about another war that was going on and that the UK was involved in, and it was just breathing in with the day's air because it wasn't a shock or a crisis at home. These wars were abroad. They don't come home to our countries, even if many of our young men and women are fighting and dying in them, in the same way that the Second World War, for example, or Vietnam War came home, we just sort of accept this with surveillance, that we're constantly at war, and I'm speaking about the US in particular. And what I've learned from my Australian friends and colleagues is how much Australia is under the thumb of the US. So many of the things that I say about the US probably pertain here as well, unfortunately. And the last one, I think, in terms of why I think we're losing our democracy, and I don't know, even if it doesn't seem that way, because we're being told that we're just as democratic as we always were, ignoring what I'm saying right now, is a word I don't like to use because I think it's overused, but it's the C word, censorship. It is something that, you thought I was going to say something else, did you? No. Censorship is, in the US, we have, everyone knows this, the First Amendment of the Constitution, which was back in 1789 ratified, and part of the Bill of Rights. It was very much, of course, a reaction to the British government that the US had overthrown and kicked out. So there was a lot of good things in that Constitution. And the First Amendment is always cited as proof that there is freedom of speech in the US and freedom of the press and freedom of assembly. Now, I don't know when they started it, but assembly, if you want to have a protest anywhere in any major US city, you need to get the police's permission first, and they can deny it. So I don't know what kind of freedom of assembly that is. But see, that's what I'm saying. Whatever I say about the US is probably going to pertain to Australia. So the government cannot exercise what's called prior restraint. They cannot tell a newspaper or a television station or even an internet site, in advance, you cannot publish this. That is the extent of it. After publication, they could prosecute you. This was made clear in the Pentagon Papers case, when Daniel Ellsberg copied the Pentagon Papers, and he first wanted to go to Congress and have someone read it into the congressional record, because under a clause in the Constitution, no member of the U.S. Congress can be questioned about anything he or she says in the middle of a legislative act, whether that's in the Capitol building in Washington or anywhere they might meet. And he or she cannot be questioned going to or from this legislative act. So in other words, anybody in the US Congress can declassify whatever they want and face no consequences whatsoever. Not legally anyway. So Ellsberg, realizing this, went to various members of Congress, and they kept turning him down. George McGovern being one of them, because he was running for president, and they didn't want to touch this. As much as McGovern and other congressmen that he went to were opposed the Vietnam War, they didn't want to read the Pentagon Papers, put it into congressional record. And Ellsberg told me in an interview I did with him back in 2008 that it dawned on him that he thought Congress would act first and then the press would report on it, but he realized it was the other way around, that he had to go to the press. And when the congressmen read something in the newspapers, they would, and their constituents were riled up about it, then they have to act. So he went to the press, and he got the New York Times and the Washington Post to start publish it. And it was at that moment that the Department of Justice under Nixon told them to stop publishing. And they did, but they sued, and they got to the Supreme Court. And the night before the Supreme Court decision, the papers were given to a senator who did read them into the congressional record, senator who's forgotten now, even in the US, Senator Mike Gravel of Alaska at the time. And now Mike's been on our vigils. He's a friend of mine because I wrote a book with him about that and other things he did in Congress back in 2008 when he briefly ran in the Democratic primary against some woman called Hillary, what's her name? Clinton, that's it. And a guy called Barack something. He got up on the stage with them, and I was in the auditorium for a lot of those debates. So Mike read the Pentagon Papers into congressional record, and as I said, he could not be charged for that. However, he knew that he'd pay a big political price, not being named to the right committees, never being able to run for president himself, although he did many, many years later. And then the very next day, that morning, the Supreme Court decided that the Nixon administration was wrong. They could not stop the publication in advance. But in that decision, the majority opinion of the Supreme Court was that after publication, they could arrest or prosecute anyone they wanted for publishing classified information. This is why I worry about Julian Assange, because legally they have the ability to do this on the Espionage Act. Even just possession and dissemination of classified material is forbidden. It's a horrible act, but it's on the books. But no government has done this because of the sentiment of the First Amendment. The government should not be seen to be doing this, even if they can, and no government has. So Nixon didn't go after Gravel, or when he published it as a book later on, not as a legislative act. And no government in the US or any president, Obama wanted to go after Assange, and they looked at it and they realized if they prosecuted him, that the New York Times and CNN, all the big media also publish classified information all the time that they're given. So they would be liable. So they backed off. They called it their New York Times problem. So they let the idea of prosecuting Assange go. But this Trump administration, with this thuggish former CIA director and now Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, it could be a different story. Now, I say all this because the government cannot do the prior restraint, but they work with Facebook, with Google, with company Twitter that are private companies, pressure them in open committee hearings on television to go after people for saying things that are considered to be dissent, that are a threat to rulers who don't want even a little spark of dissent to grow up, because they know that the society, at least in the US, is a tinderbox with a very angry population, and a protest movement can well up very, very quickly. And they understand that. They've studied this, so they want to stop it right there and prevent people from publishing and saying things that are considered dangerous to the rulers' interests, such as WikiLeaks revealing crimes and corruption of our rulers. I'm going to finish now. I'm going on. I didn't realize I'd say so much about the Pentagon Papers, although it is relevant, that it's the failure of the media to do its job that makes, unfortunately, the necessity for whistleblowers and WikiLeaks. In an ideal world, we wouldn't need Julian Assange. We wouldn't need WikiLeaks. We'd have our newspapers doing their job to keep public officials to account, to keep them responsible to the public, to serve the public and not the state, which is what is happening with the media all across. As I was speaking with James here about what's happened to ABC here, they're almost a wing of the state. So, and that's the same with private newspapers that are not in any way owned by the state, but they could just might as well be by the way that they sycophantically publish whatever government officials tell them without questioning on our behalf. And I worked a long time in corporate media, so I know the insides and how it works. I worked for big Murdoch papers like the Wall Street Journal and the Sunday Times of London. So I know the inside, and I'm glad I got the hell out, and I'm the editor of Consortium News now and taking part in the Assange defense. So if we're going to keep anything left of our democracies right now, given the failure of the media, we absolutely need WikiLeaks. We need Assange to continue to work and to be free to do what he wants. And it would be highly symbolic if he were to be freed, because it would show that this was a great victory in defense of the public and free media, which is rapidly disappearing before our eyes, no matter what they tell us. Thank you. I just want to read a quote and see if anybody can guess who said this. I think it's extremely relevant. I'm talking about the US, in the First Amendment, the founding fathers gave the free press the protection it must have to fulfill its essential role in our democracy. The press was to serve the governed, not the governors. The government's power to censor the press was abolished so that the press would remain forever free to censure the government. The press was protected so that it could bear the secrets of government and inform the people. Only a free and unrestrained press can effectively expose deception in government, and paramount among the responsibilities of a free press is the duty to prevent any part of the government from deceiving the people and sending them off to distant lands to die of foreign fevers and foreign shot and shell. That was Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black in his majority opinion in the Pentagon Papers decision in the US Supreme Court. I think those words are extremely relevant when we talk about WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. Thank you.